I don't know how many were here at our last meeting, but we had a lot of questions last year, or excuse me, at the last meeting regarding immigration. And so that's kind of what spurred this. You see there on the slide, at JAMLAC, our main mission is to seek justice for people who are struggling with poverty and oppression. So with that said, let's just kind of get right into it. Soma, we've got like I talked about, we've got a few questions to kind of get us going, but Soma, what is going on with the border, and what are your thoughts on that, and how can you kind of bring us into the discussion here?
Yeah, absolutely. And good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us. It is a beautiful Colorado evening. And so the border right now, we hear all of these things about there's a crisis at the border, there's a crisis at the border. In reality, there is a crisis at the border. What's happening recently, under the new administration, there have been processing of a lot of the people that are at the border. Most of them, huge percentage of them, are asylum seekers from Central America, some from Mexico, but there's also some from other parts of the world that are at the Mexican border trying to come in. And so there are asylum seekers that were not processed through during the last administration. There was a program that prevented them from being in the US to claim their asylum here. And so there is a change. It's a small change, but it's a change, and grateful for any type of change. So under the new administration, there's processed approximately about 4,000 people. However, there's about 26,000 people waiting to get processed. And so there's also a huge percentage of unaccompanied minor children that are crossing the border. A statistic that I saw, it's approximately about 500 children that are crossing the border every day. And so that has impacted my job more than some of the asylum seekers. And so I've seen an increase with representation for the unaccompanied minors. And just to describe what an unaccompanied minor is, it's basically children under the age of 18 who have come to this country or have presented themselves to the Border Patrol without an adult or a parent. So we'll see a lot of, siblings that come across, and that is one case that I do want to share with everyone. I did get a case a few weeks ago where it was a family of 5 siblings. And the oldest is 17, it's the older brother, and the youngest are twin 4-year-olds. And they crossed 3 countries to make it to the US. And so they're here reunited in Colorado with an aunt, and the aunt is one of my clients. I'm representing her on an application where she was a victim of a crime. And so they came in through the southern border. They were transferred to New York. We're at a detention facility there for a few weeks. And then unfortunately caught COVID at the detention center. So they had to quarantine them. And then they were finally able to be released to an aunt. And so the aunt received 5 siblings, and she has a daughter of her own. And so they're all in this it's actually a 1-bedroom apartment. That are there right now. Their story is tragic. It is tragic. They've been alone in Honduras for approximately 4 years. The mother passed away giving birth to the twins. And they don't have the fathers in the picture. And so they would be the ones that are considered unaccompanied minors.
So how did they get from Honduras to the border?
That's actually a question that I ask all of my young clients, because they all have different stories. There's specifically his answer, which is it's the 17-year-old that I spoke with. He said, You think of it, and I did it. We were in a car. We were in the back of a truck. We walked. There was a boat that we got at one point, and then we got on the train. A lot of it was the train. And so there is a train that does come from Guatemala through Mexico to the US that they call the Beast, that people jump onto this train to make it to the US. And so some of it was the train as well.
Yeah, now that you say that, I think I've seen that where there's like they sit on top of the train too, right? And it's obviously very dangerous for twin. It's hard to imagine twin 4-year-olds kind of doing that kind of a trek.
Yeah, so as they're traveling on top or on the sides of the trains or in between the train carts, sometimes they'll stand there. There are a lot of people that'll throw water to them or food in Mexico as they're passing by. It's very dangerous. It's extremely dangerous. The fact that they made it without getting robbed or kidnapped or murdered, it's pretty amazing that they actually made it safely.
How long did it take?
It took them about 2 months.
2 months.
Took them about 2 months to make it here to the US, to the aunt.
And then they went to, is that normal? Like they send them to New York? That seems kind of weird.
Yeah, so because immigration is federal and it's national, they will send them wherever there's room. So sometimes when I've had some detention clients, I've represented them that are from Texas or California. They're like, what are you doing in Colorado? And it's just, they don't have any family here. They don't have any support system. It's just according to the detention folks, it's where there's room. And so New York, I guess, was where they had room, which is kind of funny. I've never been to New York. And we had that discussion. I said, I want to go to New York one day. And he's like, that was like the highlight of all of this, that I actually got to see New York. That's what my young client said.
Well, that's kind of fun. Trying to see the light in it, right? That's correct. That's as when you're a kid. Now, when there's a question in the chat from Karen. So when do they just send them to Denver and then the aunt meets them, or what kind of support do they get when they get here?
So the aunt has to, or whatever family member or the sponsor has to pay for the flight tickets. So the family member pays for the tickets for them to be flown to Denver, and then she goes and picks them up. There's a process. There's a vetting process as well. So the sponsor or the family member has to prove that they're related. So she had to prove that she was the aunt. She has to give her identity, her home, information about her home. So they kind of have to get vetted before they just release children to people who claim to be family, because then it leads into other things and makes them more vulnerable. You don't want them released to potential human traffickers that are claiming that they're family, and then they end up trafficking them. And so the aunt went and picked them up. There's really no aftercare resources. After they're released to the sponsor, they don't get any kind of benefits. There's nothing of that kind of thing.
So there's one other little piece. I know we're supposed to be kind of doing it a little bit more podcast-like, so I'm not trying to be rude by jumping in, everyone. So one of the things that's really unique about it, in that public policy vein about unaccompanied minors, because you're under 18, you become a ward of the state. So as fast as Custom and Border Patrol takes them into custody, they go into the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the Department of Human Services is involved. I think, and so I can't remember the exact numbers. I feel like it's like maybe 60% of unaccompanied minors have a relative that's in the United States. But for those who don't, there's actually unaccompanied minors are put in foster care. And even there's a lot of different agencies that are looking for more families to become foster care parents for unaccompanied minors. One of the tragedies of this is that we don't have enough foster care families for American citizens. And so they don't want to take current foster care numbers. I guess it's more about numbers than people, but we're trying to, on the faith side, we're trying to encourage more families to actually become foster care families, because we can't take away the number that is insufficient for American children. We need to add to them. And this is a whole other category for unaccompanied minors.
Yeah, that's a big issue. And the foster parents are saints. They're awesome. Let me ask you this then, Soma. So why couldn't they do something from Honduras where they just said, hey, my mom's dead, I don't have a dad, I'm on my own, we're all little kids, can I just meet up with my aunt in Denver, instead of having them go through this whole, just an ordeal I don't even know if a better way to put it, a 2-month ordeal, and then having to deal with being incarcerated, if you will. So what's the process? Is that not available, or what's that going on with that?
So the reality is that legal options for people that are outside the country are almost non-existent. And specifically, if we continue with this little family, the siblings, there's no options. The options that are available are asylum. Asylum is one, so that is a legal way. Okay, so seeking asylum at a U.S. port of entry is a legal way to do it. So a lot of people try and do the asylum, for a couple of years under the old administration. That was just shut down. Basically, that option was not an option. You would travel and then you'd have to wait in Mexico while they processed you. And so asylum is one of them. Some of the other options are a way to come into the US is a tourist visa. But key there is a tourist visa. So it's a temporary stay. Right. And that is a process all in itself. So it's impossible to expect a 17-year-old to be able to do this tourist visa. And there's a huge ordeal with that as well. And so there's also family-based petition. So I think Michelle could definitely talk a little bit more of the family-based petition. Family-based petition is our biggest part of our immigration policies and applications. For this family in particular, that's not even an option, right? You need a parent to be in the US that has legal status to put a petition for them. So that's not an option for them. And even if you do have a family member here in the US to petition for you, you have to fit within a certain category in order to qualify for this. And then if you fall just a little bit outside the category, example, if you're over 21, if you're married, you're gonna wait about 20 years if you're in Mexico. You're gonna wait 20 years if you have a family member to petition for you. So it's a long wait for you to be able to come in lawfully. There are more options if you're in the US. And I won't go deeply into these options. That's some of what JAMLAC does. And so we're able to provide them a representation. So if you're in the US, some of the more popular topics are like DACA, right? Now, if you recently came into the US, you don't qualify for DACA. But so we represent people with the DACA application. So that's a way to do it, but you have to be in the US. Also, temporary protective status. You have to be from a certain country and also be in the US. That's also an option. And then if you, we do a lot of humanitarian applications. So if you've ever been a victim of a crime, we're able to represent people with that as well. And for the siblings, I'll be able to do a petition for them being unaccompanied minors. So I'll be able to do an application for them, and hopefully they'll be able to stay safely in the US.
Yeah, that makes me think of one of my clients that I had. Her husband killed her parents and her brother, and she fled and got to the United States, and we represented her in that regard. But it was, it's like these are people kind of at their, like, they are no kidding. They are no kidding. Their only other option is to die if they stay there.
Yeah.
And so that's a really, 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 really hard situation. So any thoughts about this last question? It's kind of here about, why are immigrants prone to becoming victims?
Yeah. Well, I think that unfortunately, society and our government has made them a vulnerable population. The circumstances, because they are immigrants, they're unaware of their rights, of the laws. They're unaware of the culture. They're unaware of the language. And so it places them in a vulnerable position. They're afraid to call the police, and they will not call the police. And so that makes them vulnerable all in itself. If people know that they don't speak the language, and they know that they're not going to call the police if they're, assaulted or things like that, then they're more likely to get assaulted.
Right.
And so unfortunately, they come in and are automatically at a disadvantage because they don't have status.
Right. Yeah. I guess there's another thought that comes to mind is that when you're afraid to go to the police, you're afraid of the protections that is afforded by police and the laws. And I know we have quite a few clients who they'll do day labor for people, and then they just won't get paid, and then they'll go call the police.
Yeah.
And I mean, which is terrible. It's terrible on a number of levels, but it really happens to people.
It absolutely does. We go through, a lot of our attorneys, our immigration attorneys go through, because of COVID and working from home, we've given some of our clients our phone numbers. That just was just what happened. Right. But we've gotten quite a few phone calls in the middle of the night from clients who've gotten pulled over and are freaking out because they're like, I just got pulled over and I don't know what to do. Are they going to take me to jail? I had just recently one of my DACA clients that the spouse called me because she went to the airport to go help somebody. I don't know. She was freaking out. And so she's like, she's being detained by immigration. I'm like, what is she doing at the airport? And it was like, thankfully they questioned her for 3 hours and released her. But it's those kinds of things. So it's just the constant fear of any kind of police contact. They're not going to call. They're afraid that they will get picked up.
Solma, I was just thinking of the whole process of VAWA. So the Violence Against Women's Act, which is what VAWA stands for, was actually a provision that the government made to recognize that victims of abuse that were immigrants had this extra vulnerability. So immigration is always really challenging to do at a national level. This isn't new for 2021. It's been a problem that has riddled our country since its inception. But there's been small pieces of legislation, sometimes around border security, sometimes around opportunity. And I don't know if you want to share about VAWA, but that is, when you think about immigrants are vulnerable anyway. But then if you're married to a US citizen who is holding that against you, like if you don't do this or is abusing you and using your undocumented status against them, you would qualify under VAWA for a particular visa. I don't know if you want to talk about that, but that really is one little provision the United States has definitely made in the last, I wouldn't say recent years, but in this last series of years to understand the special protection needed because of the vulnerability.
Yeah, and Solma, kind of, you talked about some of the legal options already, and I know you talked about not wanting to get into them, but I really like that point that you brought up, Michelle, about the Violence Against Women's Act, and it just really it really kind of points it highlights how much victims are in danger, about and throughout every day, and kind of one of those, we've somewhat weaponized the word privilege a little bit, but we all have some kind of privilege, and that's a privilege that a lot of us don't necessarily walk around with. and don't really understand. One of the things about JAMLAC is we are faith-based. I don't know if how much everybody knows about the Justice and Mercy Legal Aid Center, but we are a faith-based organization. So, we talk about the Bible all the time, and we rely on the Bible all the time. And we think about it, and we use it as direction. And so, this kind of sliding over the conversation a little bit over to Michelle, kind of maybe give us a little bit of thoughts about the Bible and what it says about immigrants and immigration. And because there's just so much, we hear so much out there in the mainstream news media, it's hard to kind of filter what's right and wrong and kind of stick with our Christian values.
There's a lot of cases and conversations around immigration, but like that moral, religious imperative, because we're dealing with human life and dignity and opportunity. It's really great to be able to share I'm a Christian, and just the Bible informs my anthropology and sociology. And so it's just great to be able to share about immigration from that and not just stay in the public policy realm. I do think that one thing, Jose, I just want to make sure for people who are new to JAMLAC, JAMLAC's faith-based, so it informs the leadership, but anybody, regardless of faith, can be serviced at JAMLAC. So it's not a litmus test. Everybody. JAMLAC's mission is to support poor and oppressed people that need justice. And it really isn't about their particular faith, but what motivates us in leadership from the board and staff is really our faith. So I just wanted to put that disclaimer. Plus, I also wanted to share, I am not seminary trained. I am public policy trained, but I have just worked in the intersection of faith and politics for a very long time. And I am a professor at Denver Seminary, but I think
that's why I said it, because I was like,
I was just told by one of the reverend doctors at the seminary level, they're like, oh, this is Michelle. She's an organic theologian. So I will just say that I'm an organic theologian, but I definitely have the opportunity and have for a long time to talk about what the Bible has to say and how Christian and Catholic faith can inform our immigration. So I just wanted to give that disclaimer, but I just also want to say thank you, JAMLAC, for all the work that you do. It really is a privilege to be in relationship with you, both formally as a board member, but also just as a community member. I live in a predominantly immigrant community, and that is the reason that I learned immigration policy. It was not something I intended on doing, but just needed to get smarter and sharper so that I could be a better community member. And so just really grateful that I've had JAMLAC as a resource that my neighbors and friends have too. So I just wanted to put that plug in and just thank you for your work and just really incredible. So proud to be a part of the organization and your leadership. So as far as, I think it's a really great hinge to go from talking about vulnerable immigrants into what the Bible has to say about immigrants, because immigrants are by nature vulnerable. You think about it, they're moving, so they haven't put down huge roots anywhere. They don't have family to fall back on that are established in the community. They don't often know the language, of course, culture. And because of that, God actually put a lot in his law in the Old Testament and also in the prophets. So the Bible is broken up into the Old Testament and the New Testament. If you're a chapter and verse kind of person, you'll be glad to know that there are actually 92 verses in the Old Testament alone that talk about immigrants. It's the Hebrew word ger, G-E-R, and it speaks to the movement of people. Some of the reason it's 92 times is because in the law, God was establishing a people and practices for those people that would give honor and dignity to everyone and protection. And there are 4 subcategories that he refers to as the vulnerable: the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. And one of the things you'll see over and over in the law is a phrase like, make sure you do this for the immigrant. Remember, you too were foreigners or immigrants in Egypt. So think about it. This whole people were moving out to become a nation in their own place, which was at the time known as Canaan, and God established the 10 commandments, which were a lot longer than 10, and spoke to making sure that you remembered at one time you didn't fit in a place either, and that you need to create special protections. If you know anything about the story of Ruth and Boaz, Naomi said, Ruth, go out and glean on the outside edges of the crop. That was a place that immigrants were allowed to. They didn't own land. They couldn't sow, seeds and reap a harvest, but they needed to be provided for. And so that was one way that the law was established. And there's so much to be said about that. Even in the prophets, there's warnings, like if you don't care about the vulnerable, the poor, the orphan, the immigrant. So you just see the very nature of God's heart and making sure that the laws of the people of Israel remembered the foreigner. That's important because we think about our laws, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. I think another thing that's just really important to know that not only does those 92 verses have a lot to do with laws and rules and warnings if you don't care about the immigrant, it's just many of the people that the patriarchs within the Old Testament, they were immigrants too. There's not too many that you can think of. I mean, the first person, of course, is Abraham. His whole time was this nomad that was moving around. Think of Joseph. He was probably somebody who was considered human trafficking. He was sold into slavery by his brothers and moved to a different land. You see Daniel, and when Judah and Israel had fallen into captivity, you had young people, the best and brightest, moved out. And then as you head even into the New Testament, you see the story of Jesus, the Christ child who was born in very humble beginnings and stayed in Bethlehem. But then there was an edict that all little boys, that political persecution that the king said, if you're a boy and you're under 2, you're dead. And so his parents were refugees of that day and picked up and moved on. So it's just really good to think about just the biblical story and all of the different ways that God has informed us to keep the needs of immigrants very present so that we don't miss the opportunity to join God in coming alongside and helping meet those needs. One of the things I do hear a lot, so I've worked in the intersection of faith and politics for probably 15, maybe more years. And when I do immigration things with a lot of pastors, especially in the early years, people would say things like, well, what about Romans 13? Romans 13 says you need to obey the law of the land. And that is true. Romans 13 does say that. And I think that that's a really important thing to start a dialogue about, but it isn't something that should shut it down. Oftentimes I see people use the Bible as a weapon to shut down conversation and not really explore what is the bigger picture there. So we are supposed to be following laws. A couple things. Romans was written during a time that was not led by a democracy. And so obviously there was no way of changing laws, and there were, people that were, supposed to be following and governing those laws. Not too late after Romans was written, basically Christianity was illegal and people were becoming martyrs and being killed. So you have to question are laws good? And that moves us up to present day. So we actually, as United States Christians, we have to look within the lens, right? And so we look at it and like, yeah, we are supposed to follow and submit to the laws and to the authority. But this is the United States where we build laws by the voice of people. And that we have to ask ourselves, is this a good law? And as Christians, we have to ask ourselves, is this law just? And is this something that reflects God's heart? Not everybody in the United States are going to have those values, but we need to, as Christians, really challenge, is this good? And if it isn't good and it isn't just, and I don't know how much time I have to explain the injustice of immigration and the need for immigration reform, but if it isn't just, our laws are actually they're contracts. That's exactly what the kind of public policy we have, that if the contract doesn't work, we have the opportunity to rewrite it. Immigration laws are not new. They're on the books. There's some that are helpful. There's some that are really limiting. And then there's some parts that just don't even deal with the problems that we need to be honest that they're problems and we need to address. And so some of it is just changing a little contract here and there. But regardless, we have the opportunity and the flexibility to change the laws. And I think we as Christians really need to understand God's heart, maybe go back and read those 92 verses, really start to get very acquainted with God's heart for justice and ensuring that people have the opportunities to move forward and flourish. In the Bible, we use the word shalom, a place of tremendous peace where nothing is broken and everything is restored. We as Christians want to ensure that the laws that we have on our books during the lifetime that we get to steward, this is our season in history to steward, that we are using our voices to ensure that those laws that we have as a contract that we want people to follow actually have shalom in mind.
We really,
I'm sorry, Joe.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking when you said that, the hard part is we want to follow the law, and just like you said, but we also want to question the law, just like you said. And sometimes it's hard to see the inequities that a law brings when you're kind of in it and when you kind of grew up with it. And it's all just what you know. I think about the laws that have been in the past where in retrospect, you look back at the Jim Crow laws, for example, and you go, hey, I don't know if those were good laws right there. Right. But for some reason, they were there. They were around for a long time.
And they were defended by the Christian church and faith in the South. So that's why we have to really step back and be careful about how we are being informed towards our laws. I wrote down the same thing. I was like, I wanted to make sure, because Jim Crow is a really good example of a time where people thought that was the moral rightness. And so I think that we really need to be willing to question and challenge the laws of our day. I will say this. I mean, I wrote a book back a few years ago, and the very first line in the book was, if you wake up in the morning and the system works for you, you think it's a good system. And that's what happens when a system works for you. You're not a vulnerable immigrant. You are a United States citizen who was born, and it works for you. So you figure that if people are undocumented, or sometimes they're called illegals, which is, I'll just let you know, is a very offensive term for people in the immigrant community. So we have to be careful of our language that we use dignity. But you hear a lot of negative things about immigrants, a lot of othering. And we have to be willing to recognize that the system works for us, but how does it not? And people like you, Jose and Steve and Solma, and those of you at JAMLAC see every single day the limitations and brokenness of laws. That's because you're trying to work with a system that is really hard and is not made. It just is just very oppressive and needs a lot of changes.
Tell me a little bit more about that word you just used, othering.
Oh my. Yeah, othering. That's kind of goes back to sort of biblical times too, where we have this idea that people who look different than us, who make different amounts of money, who come from different countries, that automatically we're just afraid. I mean, that othering, this idea that somebody other than me invokes a lot of fear. I mean, that's a very natural human response. Let me just tell you, while we have to make sure that we break down the fears really, really quickly, that is not new. I think about that even in the immigrant conversation in the Bible. So run with me here a little bit. I don't know how much you all know the story of Moses, and when people came, Joseph, when he came into Egypt, and he was welcomed. There was a famine going on. Eventually he reunited with his brothers. The presence of the Hebrew people in Egypt was not something that was threatening. But over a couple of generations, their numbers grew so much that the Egyptians started to feel threatened. It's like, wait, I don't even know if this looks like Egypt anymore. We have so many Hebrew babies and Hebrew, people rather, and they're growing so much. And that was a fear because they were other, right? So much so that the edict from Pharaoh himself was to kill, tell the midwives to kill the baby boys 3 months and younger, to make sure that, they were basically being killed off. And that's the story of Moses, that his mom hid him. But I'm just sharing that natural human response to be afraid of people almost as they grow. It's interesting because if there's one or two people in a large group, they may be the other, but there's not a fear of the other. It's when the numbers start to like, oh, wait a second, I think you're infringing on the way I knew life. And I think, like that's a really human response, but I think a better response would be, wow, I have a lot to learn. The world is bigger than people who look, like me, and how can I be an agent of hospitality? And I do want to share this one piece about the Bible. So, and I can end here if you'd like. I don't know where we are with time, but hospitality is a word that in Greek actually means philoxenia. So anytime you see the word hospitality in the New Testament, the beginning is philo and the back end is xenia. And we as Christians are told to be hospitable people, so much so that we're supposed to even not just love neighbors, but that we're supposed to love enemies. And so a defining action of the church is to practice hospitality, this philoxenia. And philo, maybe some of you are already making that connection, is actually means love. And so the first part of hospitality is love. And then xenia, maybe you're already extrapolating to xenophobia, which is a fear of strangers. Xenia is strangers. So when you build the Greek word hospitality in the New Testament, you're actually saying love of strangers. So often we have a human response that hospitality and extending hospitality is inviting your friends and your family in and opening your home. And that's a good thing. But even Jesus says, well, even the pagans do that. What would be defining for you is, are you hospitable to the other? Are you loving strangers?
And maybe the other side of that is quite probable is that most of those people are actually Christians. They're actually
exactly.
They actually are on our team, if you will, but we still are looking for something to find that othering thing, something that defines them away from them. So in essence, they're not really even that strange once we actually, meet and actually get to know someone. And I think that's something that, I have seen with my friends is that if the curtain kind of comes down, the wall comes down when you can actually put a face to an other, to when you actually know someone, and then you go, oh, they're actually just trying to take care of their family. They're just trying to, in the vein of little kids looking for some family connection in the United States because it's their only family. They're just trying to live, and that's probably what all of us would be doing if we were in that situation. So our commonality is actually probably way more than our differenthes if we really look into it.
I have so many stories from, I remember doing an event up in a really, really northern Idaho. And I was calling them living room conversations. And I had assembled faith leaders and business leaders and law enforcement in this small little town in the mountains of Idaho. And everybody there had a lot of opinions about immigrants, but almost 70% of the room had never met one. And so it's hard sometimes to believe. I live in Denver. I live in an immigrant community, but there are some people who have lived their entire lives. And these weren't 10-year-olds. They were 40, 50-year-olds who had, run businesses. And it's just, so some of that othering just comes from the lack of relationship and access and proximity to people. I've also, I should just share this one story really quickly. I've also been at the border a lot and held, migrant babies and spoken with many people who were waiting to have their asylum cases heard, or even waiting to cross illegally. They felt like they needed to get their kids, and their family had no money, no food, no water, no medicine. I remember one mother, one young mom had left her kids. Her dad was in desperate need of medication, and she just had to try to figure out how she could come and work so that she could send money back for her. And so each story is its own unique challenge. But as a person of faith, going with faith delegations, I usually am having those kinds of conversations. And at every single one of the borders, there's several different border crossings in our southern border. I've been on the Mexico side at these different places where pastors and priests and nuns and other humanitarian workers with faith backgrounds are giving people sort of their last meal. Sometimes it's communion and prayer for safe passage as they cross the border, knowing that if they don't get here to work, their families are going to die. And I've always been really sobered by joining them in prayer, wondering what is the church doing as God answers and they come.
Wow, that's like super, when you think about the power of prayer and communal prayer and how powerful those moments would be as people are just trying to survive. They're just trying to survive. I really like a couple of things. I just want to kind of start to kind of move us in the wrapping up direction. I loved what you said about the Bible says about the widows, the orphans, and then what kind of gets left out is a little bit of the poor. And then I have to be honest with you, I haven't ever really heard somebody say, put immigrant in that same category as it should be. The poor, the widows, the orphans, and the immigrants. Super powerful. And I love the thought of just making it an opportunity whenever you see, when you see an immigrant, that is an opportunity to extend that hospitality. And I don't have the Greek, Latin, phileo, deleo. I can't remember what you said, but it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thought when you think about it. And then I'm also thinking about the law side of it. And we've got these laws that are actually for immigrants, but there's such a tendency to make them the other, that we focus on these laws that are criminalize them, which it's not a criminal thing, but it makes it sound like we in the law know that it's all a civil action. It's not a criminal action, but the way it's presented is that these laws are criminal, and that's really just not true. And that's where we have, Soma working that angle, which is really special as well. And it's really complicated and complex, as Soma kind of touched on it, and I won't even attempt to touch on it because the immigration laws are so complex and they change all the time, which is hard for us to us in the normal world to go, they just changed laws just like that. Yep, they just changed laws just like that. And if you're not an immigration attorney that's working in this narrow field of immigration, then you'll find that they're going to rely on other immigration attorneys, because what they knew is true a year ago is not totally true today. And so that makes it also hard because it's all a moving target. So the next thought is, what can we do going forward? What are some thoughts that we can bring up going forward for everyone? I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. But before I get a plug from Michelle and Soma, I do want to say one of the things, and Jane, who was it that helped? Patty helped Soma. Soma was participated in developing a book. It's a comic book, okay, that is for kids, because just like some of the things that we don't hear about, I want to make sure that everybody hears about it. So when kids come across, not all of them can run into Soma and have an attorney. And because it's not a criminal act, they are not afforded an attorney by the state. So if you go to immigration court, there is a good chance that you will see a 5-year-old in court representing themselves with a prosecutor on the other side prosecuting their case. And if you can visualize what that looks like, little 5-year-old in a courtroom by themselves at a table with some headphones because they don't speak the language. You've got an adult grown prosecutor and you've got a judge in a black robe sitting up above everybody. How intimidating that must be. And this book is just a work of art to give to those kids, to give them an idea, to try and speak in their language, in cartoons, also in Spanish or whatever language it is. It's just it's hard to imagine that that's where we're at, and we have 5-year-olds representing themselves. But that is something you can do. Immigration advocacy. Soma, I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on that, or anything.
Yeah, of course. And so exactly what Jose said. So all the unaccompanied minors, as well as all the asylum seekers, they're vetted and they're all placed in deportation proceedings. So although the siblings have been reunited with the aunt, they will have to defend themselves in immigration court. So it's a federal court, a federal judge, a federal prosecutor. And so these children need to go in front of the federal judge and basically attempt to make an argument why they should remain in this country. So just to be clear, all unaccompanied minors are in deportation proceedings. Okay, so they're not allowed in the country and kind of set free, quote unquote. And so that's what I do with my young clients. I found myself as an attorney in a position that I didn't know how to explain to a 5-year-old, which has been my youngest client, that they had to go to a federal building in front of a federal judge, that they are in deportation proceedings, and kind of what their legal options are. I found myself just unable to get through to them in the way that I'm supposed to as an attorney represent them. And so this is where the coloring book was born out of. And so Patty was part of that as well, where we're able to do a coloring book to explain to them what's going to happen on the day that they go to court. Because they all have to go to court at least once or twice throughout this process. And so it's completely disturbing for me as an attorney, and it should be for everybody, to see a 5-year-old at a courthouse with headphones on, trying to listen as a judge is explaining that they are getting deported, that they're irremovable, that they've broken the law, and that they're going to start deportation proceedings. It is completely disturbing. Most of my clients afterwards will say, well, what just happened? Like, okay, let's try this again. So this coloring book, it will hopefully be helpful for the child to understand, take away some of that anxiety for them, to know what's going to happen, who are these different players in the courtroom, and also to help their sponsors so that they know what's going to happen with the kids when we go to court. We're launching that hopefully in the next month or so to be able to provide those to the kids.
Thanks, Soma. Thanks. Well, we are getting to the end of our time. We wanted to give an option for people to ask questions. Please feel free to put a question in the chat or just come off mute and ask a question if you have one. We're not stuck on being here, cutting everybody off at 8. So we're okay if anybody wants to stay around and ask questions afterward. But we really hope that we were able to communicate a little bit of the challenges that are there in the law, and also kind of see that it really shouldn't be that challenging as a Christian, using from the biblical perspective of where we're at. And again, I think I'm going to kind of stick with that picture of poor, widow, orphan, and immigrants too. Thank you, Michelle and Soma, for all that you shared tonight. But again, I want to make sure I open it up. Does anybody have any questions or anything about tonight or anything else, immigration wise, biblical wise?
I have what is a sponsor? So is a sponsor kind of a catch-all for like the family member or the foster parent, or is this a whole nother role that you can play?
Yeah, so the sponsor is usually a family member or somebody that's going to basically take custody of the kids. So they're the ones who are going to be responsible for them. The sponsor will also have to make sure that the child shows up at court and things like that. So it's basically a responsible adult that's going to be taking care of the children.
You know, Soma, another sponsor that I didn't really think about, because we've been talking about unaccompanied minors, but asylum seekers need sponsors as well. So there's a lot of people at our borders that are trying to request asylum, and part of that program has to do with sponsors too. So even if you don't want to become a foster parent, and that's a longer process anyway, you can actually sponsor adults as well, and they need that in the asylum process.
Great. So you don't have to have an actual relationship with people to be a sponsor, is what I hear you saying.
That's correct.
Interesting. Is it like a risky thing, like a kind of like a bondsman kind of a thing?
I wouldn't go as far as bondsman, but it's definitely a responsibility. You know, it's a responsibility that you're taking on, and a lot of the sponsors for my accompanied minors don't have lawful status, and so that fear is in itself. And so that's why attorney is so important, because I don't have to have the sponsor go to court when we go, because they're afraid to go into the courtroom, which makes sense. And so I will have them wait outside while me and the child go into the courtroom. And so an attorney presence is super important.
I'm sorry, Jose.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just looking at one of the questions about the outcome for unaccompanied minors and their cases. And I was going to say, I know we talk a lot about rocket docket, which is, you know, definitely during the 2014 years, unaccompanied minors were not really getting much opportunity to share their case. And there really are toddlers who are supposed to represent themselves, and children were being deported. And the reason they were calling it rocket was they were coming in, going to court, and being deported as fast as possible to their home country. I think some of that has in some ways slowed down, but I don't think the results have changed that much. Do you know the percentage of kids who are able to stay, Soma? I'd have to look it up.
Yeah, if they're able to have a sponsor and go through the process. So this type of application that I file is called an SIJS application, the Special Immigrant Juvenile Status application. And so if they do have a sponsor that goes through the requirements, then the children eventually will be able to get permanent residency, which is also known as a green card. And then eventually they can get citizenship. Right now, for children that are coming from South America, there is a two-year wait to be able to apply for the residency. So if you have a sponsor and you have an attorney, those two things, you have a high likelihood of being able to stay in the country, but you need both. So there are times I've gone to court and there's 15-year-olds that come up to me and say, can you represent me? Mm-hmm. And so I'll give them my cards and things, but a lot of them struggle with getting sponsors. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't have the sponsor, that option is not an option. And so unfortunately, more than likely, they'll get to a point by the time they get in front of a judge for their final hearing, they'll be about 19 or 20 years old, and then they'll be deported.
That's right. You know, I remember back several years ago, being at the border and some young people, they were young little boys, like I'm talking 11 and 12-year-old boys who had made it, and they were bringing death certificates of their parents who had been killed by gang members, begging for the United States government to allow them to stay. It was just so heart-wrenching. And Selma, you're right. If you do not have a sponsor and you do not have a lawyer, you almost 100% will be turned away and deported. And there's definitely, it's not just one court case, there's processes, from the very beginning. And some people, they barely have, like I said, they're in for hours. They have, go before the judge and they're gone. And if their story doesn't even have any, basically Customs and Border Patrol for several years was deciding if they should even be called before a judge. So many kids and asylum families weren't even able to ask for asylum. And I think it's also important to know asylum is legal. This is a legal way. I know you mentioned a little bit, but there's some misnomer out there that somehow people are coming to our borders and breaking the law by asking for asylum. That is the legal way.
That's right. That's right.
Well, I just want to, there's so much more we could talk about, and there's so many more stories. And I really appreciate your insight, Michelle and Solma, for kind of schooling us a little bit and talking to us, sharing some of your stories and experiences. And I also want to make sure everybody is understand. It's 8 o'clock. We totally get it. It's okay to leave if you want. I want to make sure you all know a couple things. JAMLAC.org. You can always connect with us there if you have any questions. I know there's our emails right there for Soma and Michelle and myself. So if you have any questions or you want to connect, I think one of the things, a good way to move forward is advocacy. Some of us aren't lawyers, but some of us do have some time, and some of us can just, even like Michelle said, sometimes you can just go hold babies, so to speak. And if I know Michelle has a wealth of knowledge and connections, and can put you in connect you with any organization that if you are looking for some type of way to help out. But I do want to say thank you tonight to everybody who's here. Really appreciate your presence here and your willingness to come with an open mind and learn and hear stories.